Hi, everybody. So this is my first time presenting at NACIS. And what's funny about this is that I totally have that kind of imposter syndrome, but I teach in a landscape architecture department, and I'm not a landscape architect, so I am so used to it. And so I'm going to talk today a little bit about art and maps. Again, my background here is in ecology and art, and this is a sculpture that I made, finished not long ago. I also make maps occasionally, but I teach an awful lot as a part of my job, which means that I don't get to make them a lot. I don't get to make the nice ones because I teach with landscape architects who all think that they're cartographers. No offense if anybody's going to watch this on YouTube later, but it's different. So a lot of things that I make tend to be demonstrations for classes or for small sort of event kinds of things. Hopefully that'll change. I also work with a lot of ecologists. So the last major mapping project that I did was this. We have 3 students with little to no GIS experience, and we need for them to be able to make 800 maps in about 4 weeks. They did it. And largely it was my design and they were trash, and I'm not going to show you what those look like, especially because I broke the thing. I broke it. Is it going to unbreak? There it is. So I suppose you kind of expect to sort of start with this question. And my answer to this almost 100% of the time is it doesn't matter. Whether maps are art, whether maps are not art, it's a mushy question, and I don't think it's important, especially not to kind of what I want to talk about today. And so one of the kind of quotes that I sort of have heard, especially heard kind of early on when I was really thinking about maps a lot, was this Rudolf Arnheim quote, just as some realistically painted cows are full of life while others are deadly mechanical records, so some faithful maps are alive and while others leave us untouched. And this kind of gets me to think that a lot of times when we talk about art with respect to cartography, it is a lot about being nice, being pleasant, being appealing, right? Making our maps appealing. But art's not like that. It happens, certainly, but art can be tragic, right? It can be confrontational. It can be whatever Soutine does, because that is extremely off-putting, especially when you see it out of the corner of your eye as you walk through the gallery. So I kind of think about what is it? What is it about art and how that can actually how it can and does sort of contribute to sort of the cartographic process. One of the things that I actually came down on was that art allows us to kind of communicate and understand experience in a way that I think is different than a lot of formats. So I like this example, this Alfredo Ramos Martinez painting, Zapatistas. And so this is a painting of Mexican revolutionary fighters in the Mexican Revolutionary War. And I like this because we can really sort of feel this sense of what it's like to battle with that fear, right? This is not a painting of noble lines of marching soldiers that are gallantly going off to war. This is a crowd of people. This is a jostling mess of people. You can tell by their body language that they're anxious, they're nervous. And it's all centered by this figure right in the center who is staring directly at the viewer, and well, there's a little bit of terror in his eyes, just a little bit. And so I think I like this idea about how art does this really good job of kind of translating or evoking not just niceness, not just emotion, but experience. And so I like this example in terms of sort of how this is applied to mapping. So this is a map you probably saw in the gallery from Sarah Bell. And I really like this sort of group of trees here in the corner because for me, that's not just a decoration that's sort of thrown there in the corner to fill space, right? For me, when I look at this, it gives me the impression of when you're climbing a mountain. I mostly have small mountains to deal with. I live in New Jersey. And you sort of come over the ridge line and you sort of see this vista open up in front of you. And that's the impression that I get when I look at this map because of the application of just those few trees in the corner like that. So again, this idea that through art and through thinking about our process kind of artistically, we can communicate experiences about place through our maps. There's also this idea to me that about how art kind of allows us to frame the relationship between the audience and our subject. And I'm going to get a drink of water here. So this is another example from art that I really like because it's the same thing, right? It's the same subject. It's essentially the same data. This is a violin, a bow, some music. There's even a letter in both cases. But one of these was painted by American artist William Michael Harnett in 1886. And one of them was painted by Juan Gris in Paris in 1930. And these, 1913, thank you. And these are so reflective of the time and place. And so we kind of think about this sort of, the artist is sort of using this, this sort of data, this object as more of a medium for telling us about the place and the time and the experience. And we sort of, this happens in maps too, right? So these are sort of two maps, very different in style, very different in content, but ultimately what it comes down to is that materially, this is the same thing. It is about a place and conditions as they vary across that place. And what we're really coming down to is that we're making decisions about how to represent those in terms of how the reader should interpret what's going on there, right? And if we take these two examples and we switch the styles, it's absurd, right? The idea that we would use this Disneyland style to talk about, the Leningrad front would be ridiculous, right? So we're sort of allowing us to sort of communicate sort of a little bit of that idea of kind of, making that sort of same mapicity space, if you will. I also kind of like to sort of come back here to Google Maps, because we look at Google Maps a lot, whether we want to or not. And so on the face of it, this might sort of break that sort of idea that I talked about in terms of kind of communicating the experience. Because this is Philadelphia, this is where I grew up. And so Google Maps doesn't really do a good job of communicating the experience of the place, right? Whether you are sort of up here, the sort of top street view image, the nice tree-lined neighborhood where I grew up, it was still a little bit dangerous, or whether you're in the sort of dead post-industrial kind of abandoned parts of the city that do still exist, Google Maps is going to give you pretty much the same, right? And so I kind of think about this, all right, well, what's the relationship that they're framing? What's the experience that they want to give? And clearly it's not just, well, we designed this map to be a well-designed base map that you can overlay your route data or your points over. It's friendly, right? So this idea is it is friendly and it is calm, and that's extremely important because when you're trying to navigate a place that you're not familiar with, it can be really scary. And so having a map that's going to, having a map style that's going to sort of be friendly and be calm and not sort of contribute to that anxiety about trying to navigate is important, right? So we kind of can apply that sort of relationship with what we're doing in our map designs. And the other part of this that I sort of have had trouble kind of getting away with is that I think that a lot of kind of cartographic best practices have been scientifically tested in a lot of cases by now, but they really do kind of derive from a tradition of sort of the way artists think. And so Arthur Robinson had this quote in a textbook, and Arthur Robinson was kind of famously opposed to the idea that maps are that's our art. As this quote, people or map readers think and react in certain ways to certain visual stimuli, and with knowledge and principles of the laws governing these reactions, cartographers can design the products to fit these perceptual patterns. Artists have known that for hundreds of years. So this here is Rembrandt and the application of the chiaroscuro method of painting that originated in kind of the Dutch and Italian Renaissance. And we know the effect that this has. It draws the eye to the sort of areas where there's light, where the artist wants to place it. It sort of gives sort of access to that information. It's dramatic. It has sort of an emotional resonance. And this is not one of those things that's just a style that comes and goes, right? This becomes a kind of fundamental notion because hundreds of years later, it's still being used, right? It's still being used for the same purposes because it works. But like I said, this is, we can be, we've been scientific, we've tested this, we've been really analytical about this. But also this is, the domain of artists as well. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the image here on the left. It's confusing for me because I'm turning around. Right, and so this is, if you haven't actually read Semiology of Graphics, I'm sure you all have, but I was presented with this information from about 15 different textbooks and 15 different authors who had their own idea of why they understood this stuff better. But the actual original really, I think, is better than most of those explanations. Right, and so this is this sort of interpretation of these sort of retinal variables and how we can sort of modify the sort of appearance of our points and our lines and our symbols in ways that communicate information, right? And this book was originally published in 1967. On the other side here, this is a page from the pedagogical sketchbook of Paul Klee, who was an expressionist artist of the Blue Rider expressionist group. And they had this idea that perceptible objects, perceptible items, could have emotional resonance on their own without respect to the subject matter. And so what we see here in this particular page is how we can vary a line to communicate different types of sensations about different objects. And in this case, it was different elements. So we can see this sort of curved line that sort of widens at both ends is, there's sort of air, right? We see this sort of squiggly line that sort of narrows at the peaks and thickens through the troughs, right? And that's water. We kind of see this very sort of chunky variation of this sort of step stair line. That's kind of your earth. And so this is, 100 pages of this very sort of analytical approach to how do we change, how do we modify these shapes, basic perceptible elements to communicate information, in this case, emotional information, but there was a lot of argument in that. There was a lot of, what is art for? Is art as sort of personal expression important or meaningful? Some said it was, some said it wasn't. There was a lot of fights in sort of modern art. Period. So that's kind of all I had to sort of produce. I know it's a little bit short. So I think the sort of the thing I should come away with this from is even if you're not making an art map, because I know that we all sort of think, there are serious, we don't all think. So there is this sort of, there's serious maps, and then there are maps to be enjoyed as art, and there's a little bit of space in between. And I think that applying a little bit of that sort of artistic thinking, even in your very serious sort of data-driven, information-focused maps, is still important and still is still meaningful, and actually can get you a little bit closer to being able to kind of communicate what you're trying to communicate to your audience. So thank you. I don't have a website with my slides. I don't, but you can email me if you're interested, or if you have any questions. So I guess we have a couple of minutes if anybody has any questions. Thank you.
Yes, and like Dave